In the last few years, dozens of U.S. states have passed hundreds of anti-trans bills. It's a big problem that's become nearly as common here as corrupt politicians. But sometimes it's important to take a step back and remember, this isn't normal. For example, this past weekend showed what happens in a respectable country when the bigot brigade proposed so much as one anti-trans bill. From Pink News. On Sunday, thousands of demonstrators protested in French cities after right-wing senators tabled legislation on gender transition, calling it an offensive on trans rights and therefore on human rights. More than 800 groups, activists, members of parliament, blue-collar folk, and young people alike took to the streets in at least 30 cities, chanting anti-patriarchy, anti-capitalism, solidarity with trans people all over the world, which probably sounds better in French, and brandishing placards calling for health resources for transitions. There were, of course, counter-protesters as well. A French journalist reported seeing two people throwing small stones at protesters in Montpellier. There they were, France's two transphobes. One speaker at the demonstration said, quote, "Today there is an urgent need to defend the rights of all people at a time when right-wing and far-right politicians are attacking the rights of trans people and disseminating false information about trans-identifying children. We know what happens when the powerful start stripping a minority of their humanity. It happens so fast. We cannot allow hate any foothold." The US and UK used to understand that too. We can see it in our own histories, where trans people have existed openly for hundreds of years, often acknowledged or accepted by the government of the nation they lived in. That, too, is good news of the week, in its way. In fact, this is the very first ever Trans Plus History Week. Founder Marty Davies said in interviews that while Trans Day of Visibility is critically important and Trans Day of Remembrance helps the community carry on after tragedy, one thing that's missing is trans history. So many people don't realize trans people have always been here. Just look at these two Women of the Year awards, two trans women, 50 years apart.
Christine Jorgensen, the ex-GI who was changed into a woman by Danish surgeons, is voted the Woman of the Year by the Scandinavian Societies of Greater New York and receives a certificate citing her contributions to science with feminine modesty.
Dylan Mulvaney accepts the Woman of the Year award.
No matter how many surgeries he gets, no matter how much lipstick he puts on, no matter how many sparkly dresses he puts on, he'll never be accepted as a woman.
So, let's meet a few trans people of the past and see if we might learn something. First, there's Frances Thompson, a trans black woman who testified before the U.S. Congress in 1866 following a violent riot in Memphis. She lived as a woman as a slave, and she lived as a woman after the war. The Civil War. Yes, that long ago. While the federal government recognized her status as a woman, in fact, didn't even consider the matter worthy of government attention, because it isn't anyone's business, the people she was there to testify against did have a problem. It took them 10 years, but in 1876 they finally got revenge by having her arrested for, quote, being a man in a dress. She was fined $50, equivalent to nearly $16,000 today, and sent to prison to work on a chain gang. She died shortly after her release from dysentery that she contracted while in prison. There are a lot of takeaways from that story. Racism, problems with the prison system that still aren't much changed today, ridiculous fines, and more. But most pertinent of all right now, she lived as a trans person just fine. Her neighbors accepted her. Her government accepted her. It was transphobia that killed her. Then there's Mark Weston. Born in 1905 and assigned female at birth, Mark became a national track and field champion at 20 years old, winning again in 1928 and taking multiple championship titles in 1929. In 1936, Mark retired from competitions, changed his name to Mark, and underwent a series of surgeries to correct his anatomical situation. He later married, and the couple went on to have 3 children. And here's Colonel Emilio Robles Avila, born in 1889 and raised in the Catholic Church. He joined the Mexican Revolution in his 20s. He finished that war and helped put down a rebellion before coming out openly and insisting on being referred to as a male by the name of Colonel Robles. It is said he was completely open about his gender identity, but was very firm about people respecting it. His military record had him registered as a male, but it was an open secret that he presented in accord with his birth gender during the Revolution. Like Mark, he later married, yes, as a Catholic, and the couple went on to raise a daughter. This is Lucy Hicks Anderson, who transitioned at age 15 in 1901. Here, she's pictured with a sheriff and a local rum runner, both outside her speakeasy during the Prohibition era. Then there are these 2 trans brothers, Mark and David Farrow, from an article in 1939 calling them brave. In the Daily Mail? How the standards of journalism have fallen, for shame! And isn't it funny that the same outlet that published on trans kids 85 years ago is today saying transgender is a new thing and trans kids don't exist? This is your archive, Daily Mail. We can see it. And speaking of archives, here's a show from over 50 years ago in the UK, also known as Turf Island.
Of the 4 of us in the studio this evening, 2 are transsexuals awaiting sexual conversion surgery, and the other 2, including myself, are what are known as sex changers, woman born of man. Now, Jan and Rachel here have not yet had the sexual conversion surgery, which is referred to all the time by transsexuals as the operation. So if we talk about the operation, you'll know we're talking about that and nothing else. Jan, could you give the viewers some brief idea of the way you find life at the moment as a pre-op transsexual?
Yes, I find life at the moment, waiting for this op, is like living on the edge of a volcano.
Yes.
Because if anything happened to me, if I got knocked down by a bus or car or anything, or taken ill, and I was put into hospital, and they found out I was still biologically male, I would be put into a men's ward, which would be too embarrassing for words.
Yes.
Or if I wasn't put in a men's ward, I'd be put in a sort of side ward, and you're made to feel an oddity, whereas I feel I'm not an oddity.
People often ask me,
Yes, I do
are you
think-
happier? I don't think that's relevant.
No, because
I don't
happiness-
think
no.
exactly.
Happiness
One
is
is
a
not
byproduct
necessarily
of
anything,
anything,
yes,
anyway.
it's a byproduct. And
But I do think you're definitely
what
driven.
matters is, are you your true self as much as
Ah,
you can be as
that's
a
it.
human
Yeah,
being?
that is,
Yes.
yes.
Are you really
Certainly.
together?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And if you're an ant, there's no good beefing about the fact you're not an elephant. You have to accept the fact you're an ant, right?
Yeah.
And we have this...
I've just
This-
accepted completely that I'm me. I mean, this is me.
yes.
Yes, trans people on TV, and it wasn't even a scandal. How curious that the transphobes of today can't even remember things from their own lifetimes. And just for fun, here's an ad for HRT from 1926. 98 years ago. It's worth noting that, like most trans medicine, it was originally created for cis people. I selected these stories to show that trans people were known to exist publicly over 150 years ago, and that even well into the 20th century, almost every person, the governments, and even the Catholic Church just treated us like the people we are. It isn't being trans that's a new phenomenon. It's making a political issue out of us existing that the world hasn't seen before. Any country that really does value human rights wouldn't stand for this. And yet, here we are. So I really have to wonder, if transphobes aren't after us because we're a new thing nobody understands, or because the church says so, or because the laws can't figure out how to account for us existing in society, then What exactly is the purpose they're serving? It isn't protecting people, they're harming people. It isn't protecting freedom, they're dismantling freedom just to get to us. It isn't holy writ or royal command or even some vague principle about the feminine they never actually lift a finger to advocate for. So what's the point? Or, more precisely, what's in it for them? Trans Plus History Week runs May 6th through 12th, and many of the historical trans people whose biographies are deeply abridged here are also depicted in Eli Ehrlich's forthcoming book on the subject. For the Transpositions, I've been Ember Belrad.
We realize that a change in the law will take time. But a change in public attitudes, and perhaps a change in your attitude too, can begin tonight. And after all, it is that which is really paramount. I still feel we do need all of us to accept ourselves for what we are, members of an intersex species in a sense at least, still moving along the evolutionary path. And to do this, and to accept the changes we have suggested, would then in that case be not merely a win for us, but a win for you, for humanity, both for who it is and for what it is. Good night.